So the National Center for Leadership in Intensive Intervention is an OSEP project to build capacity for people to do intensive intervention. And so there are, I think, going to be a total of 28 scholars who are going to go through the program. They've got 4 years of funding. And, you know, we wanted them to think about intensive intervention in a lot of different ways. So they've already learned about data-based individualization, which is kind of the way that the National Center on Intensive Intervention has thought about intensive intervention, is, you know, using the DBI process. And for this module, Doug and I have been interested in thinking about other ways of thinking about intensive intervention. And that brought us to this sort of piece. So if you think about like DBI, it is sort of this, you know, idiopathic approach where we're, you know, sort of saying this is, you know, individualizing for individual kids. What exactly does a single kid need, and tailoring an intervention to that kid. But that's only one way to think about intensive intervention. And one way that we know a lot of people in the field think about it is, you know, we don't design programs just for one kid. We design programs for a range of kids, you know, different kids. And that might be a way to think about intensive intervention too. So that's, you know, more of a, you know, nomothetic approach, you know, it applies more broadly. And so, you know, we were really interested to hear from folks like you, and we're really thrilled to get you to do this, about, you know, sort of your view of, you know, how should we look at kids in terms of as individuals, and to what degree should we be looking at sort of principles based on, you know, lots of things we understand about child development and learning in a general way, you know, because a lot of people do that work. So does that make sense? Does that seem okay? Great. So then I'm just going to jump into the questions. So would you characterize your work as taking an idiopathic, that is a, you know, very specific approach, or a nomothetic, that is looking for general principles approach to designing and implementing interventions for kids with disabilities?
Well, I think the majority of my work has definitely fallen in the nomothetic classification of or approach to intervention. My general training and philosophy and theory has been based on a design of instruction approach, and so the way that I have structured interventions over my career has been to really first look at the design of instruction and using best principles that way, and then trying to test those with an approach. So, you know, I think by design, special education is specially designed instruction. And so even though I've worked and would characterize my work as nomothetic, I believe that it has a very specialized focus that adheres to design of instruction principles.
Yeah. So with regard to that piece about, you know, the individualization, we wondered, the second question is, has your research changed the way you think about the students you study? And, you know, the idea here was to think about the quote from Yuri Bronfenbrenner, I think it is, that Doug remembered, you know, the best way to understand something is to try to change it. And has that changed, you know, by working with students, has that changed the way you think about their needs specifically?
I agree with Doug that, you know, trying to intervene to see if you can change, in my case, reading achievement has been certainly a logical way to approach things. And if it's changed, I'm looking at my notes a little bit. I think to some degree my approach has changed, but it has changed to the degree that I think that we can know sooner when we need to change intervention. I'm thinking of a study that I did with my Cohen and colleagues, And because it was an experimental design, we had to go through a designated period of time before we started to make intervention changes. But by the second phase, which was about week 8, we could identify students that needed something different at that point. And so I think Mike and I characterized that work as a hybrid approach, in the sense that we started with a well-designed intervention that was based on general principles, but then by about week 8, we could identify a small group of students who were not making adequate progress. So definitely using kind of formative assessment, we would make changes to intervention based on that. Yeah. So if we have data now that showed that without any changes in intervention, and pretty significant changes in intervention, those students made not enough progress.
So following up on that a little bit, and this isn't on the list of questions, but when you guys made those changes, did you change it sort of qualitatively? Were there things that you all did, you gave them different kinds of instruction, or was it sort of about dosage and repetition and things like that?
Yeah, good question. So what we tried to do was kind of split the difference between kind of standard protocol and individualized instruction, and to try to make it more feasible for the interventionists to deliver. So we identified a certain set point in time when we would collect data, and if students did not meet benchmarks or adequate progress on 2 successive data points, then we looked at their performance, and we looked at the errors that they make and the content they didn't master, and we repeated lessons that where they were showing areas that had not been mastered. And so it was really using data to identify content that had not been mastered, and then in this case, alphabetic understanding and phonemic awareness, and going back to those lessons. Now, we were still doing group instruction, and just because of the feasibility of schools, so we had to, we regrouped students as well at those points to try to create more homogeneous groups. And even within those groups, there were skill differences, though, that some students had. So it was still not a completely individualized approach to instruction.
Right. So taking that a little bit further then, too, so you guys did a focus on, reteaching certain skills that you thought they were lacking. So that is sort of more individualized, but still in the small groups. And one thing that a lot of people have been thinking about is cognitive training, or being really responsive to students' really specific needs. So, for example, doing something related to, executive function or working memory. And you guys haven't put that stuff into your interventions. I'm curious to hear, what do you think about all that stuff? Think about the 70s and when, folks did all those kinds of studies, and they, the Hamill folks, just found that the data were all wrong. And, there's no evidence for this kind of training. And so since then, it hasn't been used, and it's sort of coming back a little bit. And I'm kind of curious to hear, what do you think about all that?
Well, I was actually teaching in the late 70s, so I was, I had the Illinois Test of Psycholinguistic Abilities manual, and we're doing those. And I think what came out of those studies was certainly that the auditory, in particular phonemic awareness skills, were one of the causal factors that were causing students to have difficulties. So I think there was certainly some value in those studies that were done to teach us what was causal and what was not. But with respect to that, I certainly have seen students who have auditory memory, working memory, attention difficulties, but our intervention doesn't it addresses that through design of instruction, rather than trying to teach those skills, the processes. So, for instance, we have students who 30 minutes of intervention was just too long for those students to be able to attend. So in the real world, in the ideal world, we would be able to break intervention periods into shorter chunks for those students, maybe 10 to 15 minutes, and see them multiple times during the day, rather to address those attention memory issues. So rather than trying to address the processes, we do that through intervention design and manipulating the amount of content, the amount of repetition, opportunities to respond to increase engagement. So that's my approach to it.
And so just to kind of summarize what I'm hearing, so you guys would identify some sort of perceived need. These kids seem to have attention challenges that make 30 minutes totally impossible. And so, maybe you don't do a lot of cognitive testing. You just kind of notice these are kids who seem to have attention problems, and then you give them sort of it broken up in smaller ways because that's what seems to be the challenge. So instead of sort of, designing a domain general kind of working memory intervention, you build into the interventions you guys design themselves things that would be kind of responsive to those challenges. So it's specific to reading. Am I capturing it?
You did capture that. Now, when we were doing those adjustments and interventions, we were not collecting attention data or memory data. So what we were looking at is achievement and also doing observations. So based on the achievement data, we're finding that students are not getting it. So, but you could also do observations and look to see that students are having difficulty attending to that a longer period of intervention, so trying to adjust things that way, yes.
And now, is this just to clarify a little bit more too, did you do this for small groups, or did you guys individualize it? Like some groups got this sort of broken up piece and some groups just got the larger 30-minute blocks, or did you kind of just decide everybody could kind of benefit from the same thing?
We only manipulated the lessons that students were taught, and by default, what happened was that some of the students who needed the repeated lessons also ended up being in smaller groups. So there was more that increased opportunities to respond and engagement accordingly. So we did not specifically classify and regroup students based on attention or memory problems, but it was really based on the achievement data that we had.
Yeah, that's great. So let me ask the third question. Could the interventions you design be applied successfully to students without a need for intensive intervention? If so, do you do that in your own work? And well, let me just ask that part of it.
So let me talk about two different groups of students. So in the group of students that we've been talking about in the study, they were kindergarten students, and I think your question was, could it be applied to students without?
Maybe I said yes, without disabilities, yeah.
Yeah. Because they were in kindergarten, most of these students had not been identified as having learning disabilities. Many of them were, because of their age, received some speech-language intervention. Some were identified with developmental disabilities, but the majority of students in kindergarten had not had a special education classification. But what we did find was we needed to be smarter about the students in intervention. And what we learned is that by our screening data, we could be more precise regarding the students who needed intervention rather than not. So in the first year, we used letter naming, fluency, and phonemic awareness data to identify students. but we found that students who came in with higher scores, and I don't mean really high scores, like they knew 3 or 4 letter names, didn't benefit differentially in intervention than students who were receiving typical practice, but it was the students who knew no letter names or 1 letter name at the beginning that benefited from the intervention. So I really do think we need to be smarter about and more efficient about the students that we're identifying, and we can do that. So, and we did that in subsequent studies.
That's great. That's great. So going forward in the field, do you think that we're going to go in a more nomothetic direction or a more idiopathic direction as we learn more about cognition and human development? Will our interventions take one path or another? And do you think that your area of research, reading, will see that kind of change?
Devin, can I talk a little bit about that last question before I talk about the...
Please, absolutely.
I said I was going to talk about 2 groups of students. We have recently been working with upper elementary, middle, and high school students. And your question about whether this approach could be applied to students without disabilities. And our work in middle and high school was really focused on reading comprehension interventions, and we started out in general education trying to address struggling readers, and with an approach that included some work with teachers and then trying to teach students to monitor their comprehension and to be more active in their text processing by using peers and answering question prompts along the way. And what we found was that the intervention was actually more effective for the middle and higher students in the classes than it was for the lower students. So our low students didn't derive much benefit from those interventions, and the reason being was that they didn't have the word identification, vocabulary, and oral reading fluency skills that were sufficient to allow them to benefit from text processing and strategy instruction. So that was a real shock to us because we thought we were going to be benefiting the more struggling readers, but that was not the case.
Yeah. So, I mean, that sort of does lead to the next question. You know, what do you do with that? If you have an intervention like that that doesn't produce results for the kids we care about most, what's the future going to be? Do you think we'll be able to help those kids better as we learn more about cognition, human development, or are we going to continue to struggle with that? Not exactly the question number 4, but
yeah. Well, I think with respect to younger students, I think we can be, I think we're further along in that area of work with respect to how to intensify intervention. And I'm honestly not sure that the cognitive processing approach is going to, with respect to the majority of students, my tendency is to still look at the instructional variables that you can manipulate to intensify intervention. And I think there's still quite a bit of work to do in that area with respect to the factors that are most influential. And I was looking at some of the work when we designed some of our studies with the kindergarten students, and there haven't really been a lot of comparative experimental studies that have looked at different manipulations to be able to figure out what works for what students. And so I think that there's still quite a bit of work to be done in that area. With the older students, I think it's very, very difficult to disentangle some of the factors that are causally related to their reading difficulties. I think earlier, with kindergarten students, you can intercept some of that, the influence and effect of early alphabetic and early reading difficulties that will certainly prevent vocabulary challenges and vocabulary deficits from accruing. But what we're seeing is by third grade and above, some of those cumulative vocabulary deficits have gotten pretty large that differentiate students, and it's really hard to sort out. The majority of our secondary students had both vocabulary and word identification and fluency problems, and so trying to figure out where to intervene and specifically individualize. It would be important work to do to try to address a nomothetic versus a more individualized approach at the secondary level. And there's still quite a bit of work that needs to be done there.
Yeah, and I've been starting a middle school study with Jade Wexler, who worked with Sharon Vaughn, and this is a whole new world to me, the middle school stuff, and it is really fascinating. And, it just brings to mind that study that Sharon did, the big RTI study with a tiered intervention model, where, the best thing they could do was prevent the gap from growing. They couldn't, the kids who weren't in their intervention sort of, went really far down. The kids who were in their intervention, they didn't close the gap. They were only able to maintain it. And so, like you say, there is clearly a lot we can do. Pushing a little bit on the cognitive piece, do you think there's any way in which, some information from, developmental psych could help us think about ways to do that? Or, you said already, we need to focus on the way we deliver instruction quite a bit. Do you think there's anything that could come out of that literature that could help us?
I do think there is. Some of the studies that we're doing, and I am not a cognitive psychologist, so I'm sure that we could use better measures than the ones that we've done, but we're not finding that our measures of working memory are differentiating response yet. But it's really eye-opening to see a middle school student read a passage and then not be able to recall but one or two sentences. So it's there is something going on there that is certainly cognitive in nature, but some of those underlying memory problems or memory difficulties or attention difficulties have over time cause some pretty significant gaps in what students know, and trying to figure out how to best address those is a big challenge.
Yeah, it goes back to what you said about early intervention, and it just spirals, it accrues over time, and it's a whole constellation of things that are the problem, as you say. And that makes sense. So, in general, what would you say is an area that you would regard as very important and very understudied?
So I'm looking at my notes. I really don't think we have enough research in how to intensify intervention effectively. I just think that there's still, we're at the tip of the iceberg with respect to how we manipulate variables and how we intensify with respect to dosage, content, grouping, those kinds of things. I think the areas of upper elementary and secondary students' comprehension difficulties are woefully understudied, and the focus has really been on strategies, which is certainly important, but we're finding that some of Don Compton's work about the knowledge and content acquisition, cumulative deficits that have occurred, we've got to figure out how to address those. One of the big things that I still don't think we've mastered is how to design interventions that teachers can actually deliver effectively. We created these, we think, very elegant interventions, but we can't get them implemented in classrooms, and in large part because teachers have a lot of competing priorities. And this is mainly in general education classrooms. I think we are doing a much better job of getting interventions delivered in secondary Tier 2 interventions. But even then, we have trying to figure out how to get interventions delivered effectively is something that I've been working on for 30 years and haven't figured it out yet.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. That's the work we're doing too, and it's very hard to get people to understand all the variables and change their practice. And it's amazing too. I mean, a lot, like you said, we design these interventions that are supposed to be, carefully designed. So there isn't a lot of, there's not a lot you could change or you would have to change. And people still don't implement things the way we've intended. And, they kind of take pieces of it and they change around. I had a teacher who recently told me she was doing Project Read, and then I watched the class, and she had taken the words from Project Read and did virtually nothing else, and, it's idiosyncratic, but teachers do lots of different things because they think they're meeting kids' needs, but the result is, not a lot of improvement. I mean, have you seen stuff like that too?
I really have a newfound appreciation for upper elementary, middle school teachers and what they are tasked with doing, and really we don't have enough well-prepared middle secondary teachers who can deliver reading interventions. I mean, not in general ed, but in pull-out settings. The intervention teachers that we've been working with, most of them have not had formal training in reading interventions. So we have a lot of work to do there. And I don't want to water down the interventions, but I also believe that we should start out with something that's feasible and maybe build on it rather than starting out with the whole package. And I mean, some of my colleagues and I have talked about how to effectively design interventions, and maybe the build-up model is the way to go rather than trying to start out with everything. But so yeah, how to design interventions, how to intensify them, how do we prepare the next generation of teachers that are working with students who need intensive interventions. I just don't think there are lots of great research questions for young folks like you to be working on.
Fantastic, that's great. So last question is, what papers and other resources would you recommend to our scholars to help them understand this as you see it?
Well, I talked with some of my colleagues here. There's a paper by Jeremy Misiak and Sharon Vaughn and Carlos Dubing, and I can send it to you. You probably have it. That's looking at the cognitive processing variables and achievement. I really do like our paper that Mike Coyne and I did that was published in Exceptional Children as a first step, but it certainly needs to be there. 3 or 4 more studies that need to follow that one as far as, okay, we found that there are students who aren't benefiting, but what do we need to do? We also had a paper published in Journal of Learning Disabilities recently that looked at trajectories of students that helped us figure out, wow, it was the students who were making early mastery that really contributed to the differences in intervention, and students who just repeating lessons was not enough for those struggling readers, and so we have a lot more questions to figure out.
Yeah, that's great. Any final words for our scholars?
Yes, I encourage you to not lose sight of the power of instructional design. A lot of times universities aren't teaching instructional design classes anymore, and I think that if you have a chance to read some of Engelman and Carnine's earlier work, that was something that has influenced my career across the way. So those are some classes that I think are falling off the table now, so I think paying attention to those. And I don't know if you offer a design of instruction class at Connecticut or not.
Yeah, I actually teach that class, and
Great.
At some point I'll send you the syllabus, and you can let me know if we're doing the thing you're talking about. But I think that we are, because I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think some of the most, when I walk into classrooms, especially in middle school, now when I see that differentiates, the classrooms where things seem to be going well from the classrooms where they aren't, is the features of effective instruction? How many opportunities to respond are there? How clear are the teachers in presenting material? How much they actually explain things, model, practice, and so on. And so, you know, even if the content, you know, is, you know, regardless of content, I see that that's a real need. So I agree with that completely. So that's great.